The week before the meeting with Wenbo Chen passed the way all waiting passed when you knew how to use it, not as empty time, but as preparation dressed in the clothing of stillness. I ate 3 full meals a day, which Xiao Hui escalated from quiet approval to visible emotion by the 4th day, pressing better cuts of meat and warmer soups onto the tray with the determined generosity of someone making up for 2 years of watching a person not eat. I let her. The body needed it. I could feel the change already. Not strength exactly, not yet, but the absence of a certain hollowness, as if the rooms inside me were beginning to be furnished again. I walked, farther each day, mapping the palace as I went, building the geography of it the way I had built the geography of every place I had ever worked, not the official map, which told you where things were supposed to be, but the real map, which told you where things actually were, where the guards were slow, where the walls had shadows at certain hours, which servants moved between which pavilions, and what they carried, and how often. The Donghua Palace was large enough to be a city and old enough to have the particular complexity of a place that had been added to and modified and quietly rearranged over generations, so that the official architecture and the lived architecture had diverged in small but significant ways. I noted all of it. I also watched Kui Fen. The attendant had been placed in Mingju's service 2 years ago, timed precisely with the beginning of the illness. She was friendly, competent, and possessed of a quality of attentiveness that I recognized from the inside. She was always slightly more aware of where I was and what I was doing than a servant needed to be. Not suspiciously so, not if you were not looking for it. She was too good at making it seem like natural care. She reported to someone. I did not know who, but I had begun to construct the shape of it from the pattern of her small absences, a quarter hour here, a half hour there, always plausible, always at the same intervals, every 3 days. Whoever she reported to liked consistency. On the 5th day, I made a decision about Kui Fen. I did not confront her, I did not dismiss her. I began instead to be slightly more careless in front of her, letting her see things that were worth reporting, things that were true enough to be convincing and incomplete enough to be useful. I mentioned within her hearing that I had been sleeping badly, that the cold air of the garden tired me more than I expected, that I found the tonic bitter this week. I wanted whoever was receiving her reports to believe that the improvement was cosmetic, that Wei Mingju had roused herself briefly, as dying people sometimes do, in a final gathering of energy before the end. Let them believe they were still winning. The meeting with Wenbo Chen was arranged for the afternoon of the 7th day, in a tea house outside the inner palace that Rong Shengha used for private meetings under the pretense of scholarly discussion. It was the kind of arrangement that had been in use long enough to have become unremarkable, which was, I suspected, entirely deliberate on the scholar's part. I dressed carefully that morning. Not richly, I was not yet in a position to signal wealth or power, and doing so prematurely would alert exactly the people I needed to remain unalerted. But I chose the white robe with the silver embroidery at the cuffs and Mingju's mother's jade hairpin, and I sat for a long time looking at the face in the bronze mirror before I was satisfied with the expression it wore. Composed, present, entirely in control of itself. Not, importantly, the face of a girl who had been crying. "You look like a different person," Xiao Hui said softly from behind me. "I look like myself," I said, and meant it, in every sense that mattered. The tea-house was small and smelled of good charcoal and aged wood and the specific quality of warmth that came from a fire that had been burning long enough to saturate the walls. Rong Shengha was already there when I arrived, sitting at the low table with a cup between his hands and the expression of someone who had been doing careful thinking and had not quite finished. Across from him sat a man I wouldn't have looked at twice on a street. This was, I understood immediately, the point. Wenbo Chen was perhaps 50, perhaps older, the kind of age that settled into certain people as invisibility rather than weight. Medium height, medium build, the scholar slight that comes from decades over books, robes of plain dark cotton that had been good quality once and now comfortable. His hands were ink-stained. His face had the quality of a landscape painting done in muted colors, nothing sharp, nothing that caught the light, everything arranged to allow the eye to move past without stopping. I had known perhaps 3 people in my former life with that quality. All 3 of them had been extraordinarily dangerous. He rose when I entered and bowed at the precise correct degree for his rank relative to mine, and said in a voice of similarly precise unremarkability, "This servant pays respects to the 4th princess." "Please sit," I said, "and let us dispense with the formality. I am told you are a man who values directness." A pause, small, almost imperceptible. "I am told the same of your highness," he said, "though I confess this is a recent report." He sat. I sat across from him. Rong Xinghe between us had the expression of someone watching a conversation he had anticipated for a long time and was not entirely certain would go the direction he hoped. I poured tea for all 3 of us, which was technically not the role of a princess at a table, and which I did because it gave me an excuse to watch Wenbo Chen's hands while appearing to look at the teapot. His hands were very still. Not the stillness of tension, the stillness of training. "A letter," I said, setting down the teapot. Written in a particular phrasing, to a particular person, yields a particular response, in my former experience. Silence. Rong Xinghe's cup paused halfway to his lips. Wenbo Chen looked at me across the table, and something in his face, the quality of careful invisibility, shifted very slightly, the way a surface shifts when what is underneath it decides to press upward. "The osmanthus is flowering," he said quietly. It was the phrase Rong Xinghe had used, standing in Mingju's chamber, before he left on that first visit. I had not told anyone about that exchange. There was no way for Wenbo Chen to know it unless he had been told, or unless he had been watching, or unless it was not a coincidence at all, and the 3rd prince had chosen that phrase because someone had taught him long ago, as a way of passing a message without appearing to. I looked at Rong Xinghe. He was looking at his cup. "Third brother," I said gently. "How long have you known this man?" "Since I was 14, Rong Xinghe said. "He tutored me in the archive, classical history, border campaign records." A pause. "Things that are useful for a prince who may one day need to understand what kind of war he is walking into." I turned back to Wenbo Chen. "You have been planning this for a long time." Planning is perhaps too structured a word. Waiting, preparing, positioning pieces. He wrapped both hands around his teacup, hoping, if I am being entirely honest, that the pieces would be ready when the time came. "And are they?" He looked at me with those quiet, muted eyes and said, "You are here and thinking clearly and asking the right questions. I have been waiting 7 years for that to be true, so yes, I believe they are." 7 years. Mingju had been 10 years old 7 years ago, still a child, still in the early years after her mother's death, still in the process of becoming the girl who would spend the next several years quietly faving. And Wenbo Chen had been waiting and positioning and apparently teaching the 3rd prince classical history in case he needed to understand what kind of war he was walking into. "Tell me," I said, "everything, from the beginning." He told me. It took the better part of 2 hours, and the tea grew cold, and outside the small window the afternoon light moved through its arc and began to go amber, and I sat still the entire time and listened with the complete attention that had kept me alive for 11 years.
The beginning was 40 years ago in a succession war that the court histories recorded as a minor internal dispute resolved cleanly in favor of the current emperor's father. The histories were, as histories often are, optimistic about the cleanliness. What had actually happened was more complicated and considerably bloody, and in its aftermath, a prince was declared dead with his entire household, and the records of that prince's children were sealed and eventually destroyed, and the matter was considered closed. The prince's youngest daughter had not been in the household when it was destroyed. She was 11 years old and visiting a distant relative, and therefore had survived, in the way that people survive catastrophe, not intact, but alive. She had been taken in, given a new name, hidden in the shuffling population of minor officials and merchants that empires generated and rarely examined closely.
Her name had been Rong Minglan. She became Wei Minglan. She grew up and was pretty, and eventually attracted the attention of an official tasked with selecting candidates for the imperial consort intake, and she had entered the palace as Wei Minglan, daughter of a minor official, with no one knowing that she was the last surviving child of a dead prince, and therefore carried blood that, under the laws of succession, gave her descendants a claim that predated several of the claims currently being fought over in the quiet war of court politics. She had been careful. She had never told anyone. She had died never having told anyone, except, Wenbo Chen said quietly, for one person, a scholar who had discovered the truth through the particular doggedness of someone who spent their life in archives and who had learned, over decades, that the most important documents were the ones that had been deliberately made difficult to find. That scholar had been Wenbo Chen's teacher. He had told his most trusted student before he died, and Wenbo Chen had spent the years since then deciding what to do with the knowledge. "You could have told the emperor," Rong Xingha said. He had been listening too, although he had heard parts of this before. I could tell from the quality of his stillness, the way he absorbed certain pieces without surprise. "You could have brought the documentation forward years ago." "Yes," Wenbo Chen said, "and within a month, every piece of documentation would have been quietly destroyed, and every person who had seen it would have suffered an unfortunate accident, and the matter would have been closed again, more permanently." He looked at me. "Power does not respond well to being presented with a problem it cannot control. It responds better to being presented with a problem that is already solved. You needed the princess to be alive and capable and in possession of the information," I said, "not just the documentation." "I needed the princess," he said, "to be ready. The documents are the proof. The princess is the person the court must reckon with. One without the other is not enough." I thought about Mingju, the closed door, the osmanthus struggling in the corner of the room, the 2 years of slow poison while Wenbo Chen waited in his archive and Rong Xingha came to sit outside a door that never opened. "You knew about the physician," I said. A small silence. "I suspected," he said carefully. "I did not have proof, and I could not—" He stopped. The first time in 2 hours that he had stopped, and it told me more than the previous 2 hours had, because it showed me the seam in him, the place where the long patience had cost something. I was in a position where acting too early would have collapsed everything. The physician's patron is not a small person. Moving against them without a complete case would have been dangerous, I said. Fatal, he said, for all of us. I looked at him across the table, the cold tea, the amber light, the ink-stained hands that had spent years in an archive building a case precise enough to survive. "Who is the physician's patron?" I said. Wenbo Chen set down his cap. "The physician reports to the household of the Empress Dowager's chief lady-in-waiting, a woman named Madame Fang Lin Ru,
who has managed the Empress Dowager's affairs for 30 years and who has, in that time, accumulated connections that most ministers would envy. He paused. Madame Fang has no children of her own, but the second princess has been her particular project since childhood, the girl she has shaped, positioned, and invested in for 20 years. Shen Yue Hua, the second princess, the expensive seasonal gifts, the sharp breath at the word improving. I thought about her mother's clan controlling the northern revenue routes, about the Grand Counselor's son she was engaged to, about the ease with which she moved through the palace as if every surface existed for her convenience. I thought about how much of that ease had been built on the quiet certainty that the one person who could disrupt it all was safely dying in a room facing the wall. The second princess knows, I said. She knows enough. Whether she knows the full scope of what she is protecting, I am less certain. Madame Fang is not a woman who shares more information than necessary. But the second princess knows that that Mingju is a threat to her succession position. Yes, Wenbo Chen said. She knows that if certain information came to light, the political landscape of this court would shift in ways that would not favor her. Yes. I sat with this for a moment. Outside the window, the last of the amber light was deepening toward the gray of approaching evening. Somewhere in the distance, the palace bells marked the hour of the rooster, and I heard the faint sound of the guard rotation changing, and I thought about all the moving pieces on this board: the physician, the attendant Tsu Fen, Madame Fang Lin Ru, the Empress Dowager's household, the emperor who did not know what his dead consort had truly been, and I thought about the 11 years I had spent in a room facing the wall.
A profession required understanding boards, like this one, and I felt, for the first time since waking in this life, something close to familiar ground. "The documentation," I said. "Where is it?" "Safe," Wenbo Chen said. "In a location I will not name here. When the time comes, I know how to present it." "And when is the time?" He looked at me steadily. "The Emperor's autumn feast is in 6 weeks. Every member of the imperial family attends, every senior court official, the Empress Dowager and her entire household." A pause. "It is the largest gathering of court witnesses that occurs in a single year. If something is to be made undeniable, that is where it must happen." 6 weeks. 6 weeks to continue recovering the body. 6 weeks to dismantle the network of watchers and reporters that surrounded Mingju's pavilion without alerting the people at the top of that network. 6 weeks to prepare and position and wait until the moment was exactly right. In my former life, I had run operations on tighter timelines, but in this life, I had not been working in a body that still tired from walking too far, in a court where every movement was observed, against opponents who had 20 years of preparation on their side. I would need to be precise, patient, and I would need help. I looked at Rong Xinghe. He met my eyes, and in his face I saw the thing I had been looking for since his first visit: the assessment, the decision, the moment a person who has been waiting finally chooses their direction. "Whatever you need," he said quietly, "I am here." I nodded once. Then I looked back at Wenbo Chen. "There is one more thing," I said. "The name Wen, your family name." He went very still. "I had a handler in a former capacity. His name was Wen Shaoqi. He was a slight man who ran a trading company that never traded anything of note. I sent him a letter on my first morning in this palace, in a particular phrasing, and you said the osmanthus was flowering," Wenbo Chen said quietly. The room was very quiet. "He was my elder brother," Wenbo Chen said. He was looking at the table. His voice had not changed. It remained the careful, muted voice of a scholar, but something in the texture of it had. "He told me once that he had one operative whose situation he could not resolve cleanly,
someone who had been in the middle of a mission when the organization was ended. He did not know what had happened to her. A pause. He said that if she ever surfaced, I would know her by the phrasing, and that if she did surface, it would mean something had happened that neither of us could have predicted. "He is dead," I said. I did not ask it. 3 years ago, Wenbo Chen said. It was made to look natural. I absorbed this without allowing my face to change. Wen Shaoqi had been, in the taxonomy of my former life, one of the few people I had trusted with anything beyond professional obligation. Not a friend exactly. Friendship had been a liability I could not afford, but a person of consistent integrity in a profession where integrity was rare. I relied on his judgment. I delivered 17 missions on the basis of his intelligence and not lost a single one. He was gone, had been gone for 3 years, while I had not known, because I had been dead or something like it. I let the grief of that move through me and pass, the way I had learned to let all grief move, acknowledging it, giving it its due weight, and then setting it down, because you could not carry grief and a full workload at the same time, and I had a great deal of work to do. "I will work with you," I said to Wenbo Chen, "in his place and in your brother's memory. But I need you to understand something." He looked up. "I am not the girl who was in this body before me. It was the most honest thing I had said in this life, and I said it plainly, and I watched him decide how to receive it. I do not know entirely what I am, but I know what I am capable of, and I know how to finish what has been started here, and I will finish it. But I will do it my way, not slowly, not from cover. In 6 weeks, at the autumn feast, in front of every witness this court has to offer." Wenbo Chen studied me for a long moment. Then he said, "My brother told me once that she was the best he had ever placed, that she saw things other people missed and moved in ways no one expected." He paused. "I think I understand now what he meant." I picked up my cold tea and drank it, because cold tea was still tea and the body needed warmth. "Good," I said. "Then let us begin." The autumn feast invitation arrived at Mingju's pavilion 4 days later. This was not unusual. All members of the imperial family received invitations as a matter of form. What was unusual was that for the past 2 years, Mingju had sent her formal regrets due to poor health, and the court had long since stopped expecting her attendance. This year, I sent an acceptance. I wrote it in Mingju's hand. I had spent 3 evenings practicing it from the correspondence Xiao Hui had carefully kept, and I sealed it with the 4th princess's personal seal and sent it by the formal messenger route, which would mean it would be logged in the official household records and therefore be essentially impossible to quietly intercept. I wondered how long it would take for Shen Yuehua to hear. The answer was approximately 4 hours. I knew this because Kuifin, who reported to someone every 3 days, reported early. I watched her go from my window, through the garden, moving with the slightly too purposeful step of someone who had something worth saying. I noted the direction she walked, which gave me a new data point about where her reports went, and I noted how long she was gone, and I filed it all with the patience of someone who was building a wall, 1 precise brick at a time. The response came not from Shen Yuehua directly, but from her head attendant, a carefully worded note expressing how pleased the 2nd princess would be to have her 4th sister in attendance, and how she hoped the journey through the palace would not prove too taxing. It was the kind of note that meant the opposite of what it said in every particular, and I read it twice, smiling slightly, and wrote a response of equal graciousness, expressing my deep appreciation for 2nd sister's thoughtfulness. Xiao Hui, reading over my shoulder, said nothing, but I heard her exhale very slowly. "Your Highness," she said carefully, is playing a dangerous game. I am playing the only game available. Fortunately, I am very good at it." She looked at me for a long moment. In the weeks since my arrival, Xiao Hui's careful blankness had been quietly dismantling itself layer by layer, replaced with something more complicated and more real. She was not a simple woman. She had survived 3 years in this pavilion by being more perceptive than her role required and more loyal than her circumstances rewarded, and I had come to rely on her in the way I had once relied on the best local contacts a mission could provide, someone who knew the terrain from the inside. "I am going to tell you something that I have not told anyone," she said. I set down the brush. "Tell me." She sat down, not with permission, she simply sat, which was now a thing she did, the formality between us having been redistributed into something more functional. "Before the illness began, just before, perhaps 2 months before the tonic started arriving, the Lady Consort V received a visitor, a court lady, very senior, not someone who had ever visited this pavilion before." She folded her hands in her lap. "She was pleasant. She commented on the osmanthus. She left." "And after she left?" "The Lady Consort was frightened," she said simply. "I had never seen her frightened before. She was sad often, and tired, and sometimes she was grieving, but I had not seen her frightened. After this visitor left, she sat very still for a long time, and then she told me—" Xiao Hui stopped. "She told me that if anything happened to her, I should stay, that I should stay in this pavilion and watch over it and not leave, whatever they offered me." The room was very quiet. "I knew," I said. "I think she suspected," Xiao Hui said. "I think someone came to warn her, or perhaps to confirm something she had already begun to suspect about herself. And then the tonic arrived, and the illness began, and she stopped again. She became the person you found when you arrived. She had decided to go quietly, I think, because she was frightened and alone, and she did not know who to trust or how to fight something this large." She looked at me directly. "But she told me to stay." Wei Mingju, alone and frightened, had known someone was coming for her and had decided the kindest thing she could do was not fight it, had decided that going quietly was better than causing trouble for people she cared about. She had told her to stay. She had closed the door on Rong Sing Ha 6 times, and she had kept the osmanthus alive in the corner of her room, watering it and watching it not quite flower, for 2 years. I thought about that girl, the girl whose face I now wore, whose one remaining year I had inherited, and I felt something settle in me that went beyond strategy, something older.
Less manageable. A debt, maybe. Not to the universe or to fate or to whatever mechanism had placed me here. A debt to her. A specific, personal debt to a 17-year-old girl who had been frightened and alone and had decided that the bravest thing she could do was go quietly so that no one else was troubled by it. She had been wrong about that, but it had been an act of love in its terrible way, and it deserved to be answered. "The visitor," I said. "Who was she?" Xiao Hui said, "Her name was Madame Fang Lin Ru." Of course it was. She had come to look at the thing she was destroying, or perhaps to make sure Mingju understood that fighting was useless, or perhaps simply to confirm with her own eyes that the girl was sufficiently diminished to require no further intervention beyond the tonic. She had miscalculated on all 3 counts. "Thank you," I said to Xiao Hui, "for staying." She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at her hands. "I told myself I was staying because the Lady Consort asked me to," she said, "but the truth is that I was staying because I could not make myself leave. She was—" A pause. "She was very kind to me, Your Highness. Even when she had nothing, she was always very kind." I thought about the face in the bronze mirror on my first morning,
the one that had clearly cried often, and I thought about how grief, when it belonged to someone else, had a way of arriving late, finding you when you had thought yourself past being found. "Then we will repay her," I said. "Both of us." Xiaohui straightened, and in her straightening I saw the quiet backbone of someone who had been waiting for something to straighten for, who had been loyal in a vacuum for 3 years and was now finally loyal to something moving. "Yes, Your Highness," she said, and then, without being asked, she began to tell me everything else she remembered. Every name, every visit, every small detail she had stored away in 3 years of watching a room that no one else was watching. I listened, and I built the map, and outside the window the osmanthus continued its patient flowering, one small gold bloom at a time. The autumn feast was in 3 weeks when the second princess made her first visible move. It came in the form of an invitation, tea in Shen Yue Hua's pavilion, just the 2 of them, phrased as sisterly warmth, timed precisely at the midpoint between my acceptance of the feast invitation and the feast itself. She wanted to see me before the event. She wanted to assess the threat in a controlled environment of her choosing, with her own attendants around her and no witnesses whose loyalty she had not secured. It was, from a strategic perspective, a sound instinct. I accepted immediately. Her pavilion was everything mine was not: large, south-facing, flooded with the last warmth of the autumn sun, every element chosen with the careful eye of someone who understood that beauty was power, and that power should be displayed. The garden visible from her reception room was perfectly tended. The tea set on the table was the kind of porcelain that had no business existing outside a museum. Her attendants moved with the synchronized competence of people who had been trained, not merely instructed. She was already seated when I was shown in, which was a small breach of courtesy. The host rises to receive a guest, and which was entirely deliberate. She wore deep amber silk, gold at the collar and cuffs, the kind of warmth that photographed well against her complexion, and that she clearly knew it. I wore white with silver, and Mingju's mother's jade hairpin, and I had spent an hour that morning ensuring that every detail of my appearance was precisely calibrated, not to impress, not to intimidate, but to communicate a single thing. I see exactly what you are doing. I simply do not mind. "Fourth sister," she said, rising now that I was close enough to make the delayed rising seem like natural movement. Her smile was warm, professional, perfect. "It is so good to see you looking well." "Second sister is kind," I said. "The pavilion is beautiful as always." We sat. Tea was poured, by her attendant, at the correct moment, without any prompting. Everything was smooth. Everything was choreographed. She asked about my health with the specific texture of concern that is indistinguishable from genuine unless you knew to look at the eyes. I answered that I was improving steadily and watched her eyes and noted the fraction of additional warmth she produced to cover what was behind them. "Confess," she said, setting down her cup with delicate precision, "that I was surprised to hear you would attend the autumn feast. Not displeased, I am delighted, truly, but you have not attended in some years, and I want to be certain you have considered the demands of the event. It is quite long, quite crowded. Father will be present, of course, and all the senior officials. It can be overwhelming, even for those in full health."
It was very well done. Concern as a weapon, care as a warning. I looked at her across the tea table with the expression I had been practicing, the one that sat on Mingju's face without demanding anything, that revealed nothing and absorbed everything. "Second sister is thoughtful to consider my comfort," I said. "I have been thinking about the feast for some time. I find I am very much looking forward to it." A pause, very short. "Father will be pleased to see you. He asks after you, you know." I did not know. Xiao Hui had not mentioned the emperor asking after Mingju, but I filed it as either truth, The emperor did occasionally ask after his neglected daughter, out of some vestigial paternal conscience or tactic, and in either case my response was the same. "I look forward to paying my respects," I said, warmly. She changed the subject. We talked for 40 minutes about matters of no importance, a visiting scholar's new text, the quality of this year's chrysanthemum display in the Northern Garden, a rumor about a minor official's marital difficulties. She was charming throughout. I was charming throughout. The tea was excellent. The porcelain was indeed museum quality. As I rose to leave, she reached out and placed one hand briefly on my arm, a gesture of affectionate sisterhood to any observer. Her fingers pressed slightly, just slightly, enough to feel the pressure without appearing to apply it. "Fourth sister," she said softly, holding the warmth perfectly, "we know you have always had my support, whatever you need, whatever difficulties you may be facing." A pause, light as silk over a blade. "It would grieve me greatly to see you overextend yourself before you are truly recovered. These things can set a person back terribly." I looked at her hand on my arm, then I looked at her face, then I smiled, the smile I had worn in a dozen courts, the one that knew something it was choosing not to say yet. "Second sister is too generous," I said. "I would not dream of overextending myself." I left her pavilion and walked back through the palace in the amber afternoon light, unhurried, noting, without appearing to note, the attendant who followed me at a subtle distance, not Xiao Hui, someone new, someone Shen Yu Hua had tasked with observing my movements, and I thought about the pressure of her fingers on my arm and the specific softness with which she had delivered what was, structurally, a threat. She was good. She had been trained well by a woman who had spent 30 years managing the most powerful household in the empire. She was patient and controlled and had the particular confidence of someone who had never, in 20 years of careful preparation, encountered a variable she could not account for. She had not, until 8 weeks ago, needed to account for me. I had 8 weeks of recovery behind me now. The hollowness was gone. The fatigue after walking was diminishing. The body was not what I needed it to be, but it was becoming something, rebuilding itself on the foundation of regular meals and uncontaminated sleep, and the particular discipline of someone who knew how to ask a body to work, and meant it. 3 more weeks. 3 more weeks and the autumn feast, and the full court of the Donghua dynasty assembled in one room. I thought about Wen Bochen in his archive, assembling his documentation with the precision of 40 years of patience. I thought about Rong Sing Ha, who had been quietly and carefully positioning himself for weeks now, aligning his connections with the particular care of someone who had spent years near power and knew how it moved. And I thought about Xiao Hui, who knew every name and every movement in Mingju's world, and who had been waiting 3 years for something to be loyal to. And I thought about Madame Fang Linru, who had come to this pavilion to look at a frightened girl and confirm that she was too diminished to fight, who had seen exactly what she expected to see, who had walked away satisfied. She had not looked closely enough. That was the error. It was always the error. People looked at what they expected, and finding it, looked no further. They had expected a dying girl, and found one, and they had taken their eyes away, and in the space of their inattention, something else entirely had been growing. I passed through the gate of my pavilion and stopped in the doorway to look at the osmanthus plant in its corner. 23 blooms now. I had counted them each morning, a small private ritual, a way of marking time that felt more honest than the official calendar. 23 small gold flowers, patient and certain. 3 more weeks. I went inside and closed the door and began to plan. The morning of the autumn feast, I awoke before the palace bells and lay still in the darkness and took inventory. The body,
stronger than it had been in 10 weeks, which was not yet what I wanted, but was enough for what I needed. The hollowness was gone. The fatigue that had followed any sustained movement had reduced to something manageable, a background hum rather than a wall. I had been rising early every morning for 2 weeks and moving through the slow, deliberate forms I remembered from a lifetime of physical training, modified for a body still rebuilding itself, pushing the limits incrementally until they moved. They had moved. Not as far as I would have liked, but far enough. The plan, intact. Wen Bochen had sent word 3 days ago, a single line in the formal scholarly correspondence style he used for official communication, containing an embedded confirmation that the documentation was prepared, authenticated, and in the hands of a trusted third party who would present it to the emperor's private secretary at the hour of the horse, 2 hours before the feast began. This was the mechanism we had agreed upon. The documentation would reach the emperor before the feast, so that when events unfolded in the banquet hall, he would not be encountering the information for the first time. He would be a man who had spent 2 hours sitting with a truth he had not known, deciding what to do with it. In my experience, that was a more reliable condition than surprise. The pieces? In position. Rong Xinghe would be present in his official capacity, seated at the table appropriate to his rank, from which he had clear sightlines to both the emperor's dais and the area where the empress dowager's household would be seated. Xiao Hui would accompany me as my senior attendant, which was her right, and which also meant I would have, within arm's reach, the person in this palace who knew the most about everyone in the room. Wen Bochen would be present in the background as he always was, invisible, unremarkable, watching. Kui Fen had been managed. This deserved explanation. I had not dismissed her. Dismissing her would have alerted her patron immediately, and I needed Madame Fang Lin Ru to receive normal reports up until the last possible moment. Instead, 3 days ago, I had done something simpler. I had told Kui Fen in a private moment that I knew. Not how I knew, not what I intended to do about it, simply that I knew, and that her choice in the next 3 days would determine considerably how the next several years of her life unfolded. She had gone very still, and then, and this was the thing about Kui Fen that I had not fully anticipated, because she was 16 years old, and she had been placed in this role at 14, and not, I suspected, been given much choice in the matter. She had begun to cry, not with calculation, simply with the plain distress of a young person who had been carrying something too heavy and had been waiting for someone to notice. She was not, when examined from the inside, a committed villain. She was a girl from a family with debts, recruited by someone with power over those debts, doing what she had been told to do because the alternative had been made to seem impossible. She had liked Mingju. That had been the detail she could not manage to say without her voice breaking. That she had liked her, been kind to her in the small ways her role permitted, and had hated herself for every report she delivered. I had let her pry, and then I had told her exactly what she was going to do. She had delivered her final report to Madame Fang's contact 2 days ago. In it, she had described the 4th princess as fatigued, uncertain, and visibly nervous for her first public appearance in 2 years. She had mentioned that I seemed to regret my acceptance and considered sending a second letter of withdrawal. She had said that whatever brief improvement had been visible seemed to be fading. Every word of it was something I had told her to say. Madame Fang would arrive at the autumn feast tonight, believing she was managing a variable that had already been managed. She would be composed, attentive, and completely unprepared. I rose in the darkness and dressed myself, a thing I could now competently do, practice having addressed my initial incompetence with the efficiency it always did.
By the time Xiao Hui arrived with the lamp and the breakfast tray, I was already at the writing table, composed and ready. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Today." "Today," I agreed. She set down the tray and came to help with my hair, and her hands were very steady. I had asked Wen Buchen in our second meeting what Mingju's mother had looked like. He had a portrait, a small thing, painted from life by an court artist decades ago when the imperial noble consort Wei was newly arrived in the palace, young, uncertain, learning how to wear a life that fit her badly in those early years. He had obtained it through means he described only as requiring patience and a good memory for where things were misfiled. He gave it to me without being asked, as if he had known I would want it.
I had looked at it for a long time. Wei Minglan, wrong Minglan, truly. A woman who had survived catastrophe at 11 and spent the rest of her life in a careful disguise, loving people she could not tell the truth to, carrying a secret that would have saved her and that she had chosen to keep because she understood what revealing it would cost. She had the same eyes as the face in my mirror, dark, serious, watching. I had put the portrait in the sleeve of my robe and worn it to the autumn feast. The banquet hall of the Donghua Palace was designed to impress and succeeded at it absolutely. Columns of red lacquered wood rose to a ceiling painted with dragons and phoenixes in gold on a ground of deep blue. Lanterns hung in their hundreds, casting a warmth that turned every silk robe into something luminous, and the long tables arranged in their formal order created an architecture of hierarchy that anyone who had grown up in this court could read as easily as text: who sat where, who sat near who had been elevated since the last feast, and who had been subtly displaced, all of it encoded in the seating arrangement with the precision of a document. I entered at the correct moment for my rank, after the senior princes, before the lesser consorts, and I walked to my place with the pace that the body could manage, and the posture that I had been practicing for 2 weeks, and the expression that had become, by now, as natural on this face as breathing. I felt the room notice. Not loudly, not with the dramatic sweep of heads turning that occurred in stories. In reality, attention moved through a crowded room like water finding levels, gradually, quietly, until you became aware that the direction of the current had shifted. I had spent 11 years being invisible and knew exactly what visibility felt like by contrast. The court of the Donghua dynasty had not seen Wei Mingdru in 2 years, and the Wei Mingdru they had last seen had been a diminishing presence, a girl already practicing her own disappearance. What they were seeing now was something they did not quite have a category for yet. Good, let them look without understanding. Understanding would come later, and it would come at a time of my choosing. Shen Yuehua was already seated at the table appropriate to the second princess, positioned to the emperor's left, close enough to the empress dowager's section to demonstrate the relationship between the two households without being obvious about it. She looked magnificent, in deep amber again, phoenix crown catching the lantern light. She had been preparing for this feast for years, in the way that people prepare for the thing they have decided is their moment. Every detail controlled, every connection confirmed, every variable accounted for. She saw me enter. I did not look at her directly. I looked at the emperor's dais, where I needed to look, and made the appropriate obeisance in the appropriate order, and moved to my seat, and sat, and arranged my white and silver robes with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. But in my peripheral vision, I saw her attendant lean in and murmur something, and I saw Shen Yuehua's response, a minute stilling, quickly covered, a slight recalibration of her smile. The report had said I was fading. The report had said I seemed to regret coming. She was recalculating, deciding whether to be concerned. I gave her nothing to calculate with. I sat quietly and let the feast begin around me, and I was simply present, not performing confidence, not performing illness, simply present, in the way of someone who knew exactly where they were and decided to be there completely. The emperor, on his dais, was a man of 60 who had the quality of someone who had once been decisive and spent 30 years becoming careful instead. He had the scholar's brow and the administrator's eyes, and the particular, slightly removed quality of a man who had been surrounded by performance for so long that he had learned to conduct his real thinking behind a screen of formal pleasantry. He looked at the assembled court with the measured appreciation of a man fulfilling his role, and his eyes moved across the room in a sweeping arc of a host ensuring all was well, and when they reached me, they paused. Just a fraction, just the held breath of a man looking at something he had been thinking about for 2 hours. He knew, when Bo Chen's documentation had reached him, he had spent the afternoon sitting with the knowledge that the woman he had known as Wei Minglan was Rong Minglan, blood of his blood, and that the daughter she had left behind was in a room facing a wall somewhere in his palace, dying of something a physician had been administering on someone else's instruction. He was a careful man. He would not act rashly, but he was looking at me with the eyes of someone who was looking at an obligation they had failed, and the combination of those two things, guilt and caution, was something I knew how to work with. I held his gaze for exactly the correct length of time, and then looked down at my cup and let him think. The first courses came and went. Music played from behind an ornamental screen. The court performed its pleasure at the occasion with the practiced ease of people who had attended many such feasts and knew the shape of them. Conversation moved in the channels it always moved, careful, encoded, every observation doing the work of 3 different communications at once.
Madame Fang Linru sat in the section of the Empress Dowager's household, 2 tables to my right and slightly behind, close enough that I was aware of her without needing to turn my head. She was a woman of perhaps 55, fine-boned, with the posture of someone who had spent decades in proximity to power and had absorbed its particular uprightness. She was dressed impeccably. She was, to all appearances, entirely relaxed. I knew she was watching me. I did not give her anything to see. It was during the 3rd course that the first piece moved. It came from the direction of the emperor's dais, a quiet word to the senior court official seated closest to him, a murmured instruction barely visible from where I sat, delivered with the contained urgency of something that needed to happen without appearing to happen. The official rose, unhurried, and made his way to the section where the imperial physician Shen Bojiao was seated among the court medical staff. The physician was escorted out. He was escorted out in the particular way of someone being escorted, surrounded, smoothly by people whose presence communicated that this was not optional, with a courtesy that was indistinguishable from compulsion. The table around him registered it only as a brief absence, filled immediately by the music and the movement of the feast. But Madame Fang noticed. I watched, without appearing to watch, the moment the knowledge reached her. It arrived through her own network, an attendant who murmured close, a slight shift in the information she was receiving, and the effect was very small. A single breath held a fraction longer than it should have been. The particular stillness of someone who has just realized that a calculation they were certain of has been invalidated. She looked at me. I was looking at my cup. She looked away, and I knew she was now moving through her options with the quick, contained efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years managing problems in real time. She would be assessing, what did the physician's removal mean, whether it was connected to me, whether the 4th princess had somehow... She would not conclude it yet. The report had said I was fading. She trusted her sources. She was not yet afraid, she was simply adjusting, looking for the pattern. I gave her time to find the wrong one. The fourth course had barely arrived when Rong Sing Ha rose from his seat. He did it correctly, requested permission of the senior court official nearest him, received a nod, rose with the natural ease of a man going to greet someone across the hall. He crossed toward the emperor's dais, which was his right as a prince, and paused to exchange greetings along the way, unhurried, sociable in the measured way he did everything. He reached the dais and paid his respects, and then stood for a moment in quiet conversation with his father, and during that conversation he placed something on the table near the emperor's hand. A small scroll, the size of a personal document, sealed with a particular seal that anyone in the archive would have recognized and that the emperor had been looking at for 2 hours this afternoon. The confirmation document, the second authentication signed by 3 independent archival witnesses that the primary document Wen Bo Chen delivered that earlier day was genuine and unaltered and had been stored sealed for 41 years. The emperor looked at it, then he looked at his son. Then his eyes moved, slowly, across the room. To me, I had been watching him. When his eyes met mine this time, I did not look down. I held it, not as a challenge, not with anything that could be read as aggression, simply with the particular steadiness of someone who was exactly where they belonged and knew it, a stillness that was its own kind of statement. Something moved in his face, old, heavy, the expression of a man meeting an obligation that had been accumulating interest for 20 years. He looked away, and I saw him speak, quietly, to the official at his shoulder. The official nodded. Madame Fang saw this exchange. I watched her see it, and I watched her understand, not yet fully, not every piece, but enough to know that something was moving that she had not moved, enough to know that whatever she had been managing for 30 years had shifted while she was looking somewhere else. I watched the moment the careful composure of 30 years showed for just a fraction of a second the thing underneath it. Fear. Real fear, not the managed kind. She began to rise.